Which, you should have never come, my daughter-in-law shouted across the restaurant before knocking my dinner plate onto the marble floor. The sound of breaking china cut through the music so sharply that even the pianist stopped playing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. And there I stood at 68 years old, wearing the pearl necklace my late husband had given me on our 40th anniversary, staring down at mashed potatoes and roasted salmon scattered across the polished floor like something filthy that needed to be swept away. Vanessa didn't look embarrassed. That was the worst part. She looked satisfied. Her hand still rested against the edge of the tablecloth, her breathing calm, her lipstick perfect, while several people from nearby tables turned to stare at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. My son Daniel sat frozen beside her. He didn't stand up. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look at me right away. I felt every eye in the restaurant settle onto my face, waiting to see whether I would cry, yell, or collapse into the kind of scene people secretly enjoy watching from a safe distance. But I'd spent too many years learning how to survive humiliation quietly. I bent down slowly and picked up my purse from the floor. My hands trembled slightly, though I tried not to show it. A young waiter rushed over with a towel, his cheeks flushed red with panic. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he whispered, even though none of this had been his fault. Vanessa let out a sharp laugh under her breath. "Maybe now she'll finally understand she isn't wanted," she muttered loudly enough for half the dining room to hear. Daniel finally spoke then, but not to defend me. "Vanessa," he said softly, glancing around nervously. Not angry, not shocked, just embarrassed that people were watching. That hurt more than her words ever could. 2 years earlier, after my husband Richard died from a stroke, Daniel had promised me things would never change between us. He held my hands at the cemetery and told me I would always have family. I remembered standing beside him in the cold November wind while dried leaves scraped across the pavement. Near Richard's grave, Daniel had cried that day. Real tears. Or at least I thought they were real. Somewhere between then and now, my son had slowly become a stranger sitting across the room pretending not to notice when his wife humiliated his mother in public. I straightened my coat carefully. The restaurant smelled faintly of garlic butter, grilled steak, and expensive perfume. Soft jazz still floated awkwardly through the silence now that the pianist had started playing again. Around me, people lowered their eyes, pretending to return to their dinners while still listening closely enough not to miss what happened next. Vanessa crossed her arms. "You always do this," she snapped. "You show up where nobody invited you and expect everyone to revolve around you." I looked at her quietly. The reservation confirmation was still folded inside my purse. Daniel himself had invited me 3 weeks earlier to celebrate his promotion at the law firm downtown. I had even spent nearly $300 on his gift, a vintage gold watch engraved with his initials. It was still sitting unopened inside the small navy blue box in my purse. "I was invited," I said calmly. Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically and reached for her wine glass. "Of course you'd say that." Daniel finally looked at me then, but his expression wasn't loving or protective. It was tired, like I had become some exhausting problem he wished would disappear on its own. I realized in that moment that this dinner had never really been about celebrating Daniel's promotion. Vanessa wanted an audience. She wanted witnesses. She wanted to make sure everyone in that restaurant understood exactly where I stood in their lives now. Outside the tall windows behind them, Chicago rain tapped softly against the glass while headlights blurred across the wet streets below. Everything suddenly felt cold. Cold in the restaurant. Cold in my chest. Cold in the way Daniel avoided my eyes while his wife sat there smirking beside him. I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around the little watch box. For a brief second, I thought about placing it on the table anyway. But some part of me finally understood that. Begging people to value your love only teaches them how cheaply they can treat you. So instead, I gave a small nod, turned toward the exit, and began walking away while the sound of shattered porcelain still echoed faintly behind me. What Vanessa didn't realize that night was that she hadn't just thrown my dinner onto the floor. She had shattered something much more dangerous. The last piece of silence I had left inside me. The rain had turned heavier by the time I stepped outside the restaurant. Water slid down the glowing windows behind me, blurring the faces inside until everyone became shapeless shadows moving beneath warm yellow light. For a moment, I stood under the awning trying to steady my breathing while taxis sprayed water across the street, and couples hurried past holding umbrellas against the cold Chicago wind. Nobody looked at me twice out there. That was the strange thing about humiliation. Inside the room, it feels enormous, like the entire world has stopped to witness your shame. But outside, life keeps moving as if nothing happened at all. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and walked slowly toward the parking garage 3 blocks away. My knees ached more these days when it rained. Richard used to tease me about predicting storms better than the Weather Channel. The memory hit me so suddenly that I almost smiled. Almost. The elevator in the garage smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. I caught my reflection in the brushed steel doors while waiting for it to arrive. My lipstick had faded. A strand of silver hair had slipped loose near my collar. Otherwise, I looked composed. That surprised me. I had expected to look broken. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The little velvet watch box still rested inside my purse beside the folded dinner invitation. I stared at it for a long time. Daniel had loved watches since he was 12 years old. Richard bought him his first one at a small jewelry store during a family trip to Milwaukee. Daniel wore it everywhere until the strap finally broke in high school. Back then, he used to hug me before leaving the house. Back then, he still sounded proud when he introduced me to people. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the seat. Little things started returning to me then. Tiny moments I had ignored for years because mothers become experts at excusing pain when it comes from their children. Vanessa changing the Thanksgiving reservation without telling me. Vanessa laughing when Daniel forgot my birthday dinner 2 years ago. Vanessa calling me emotional every time I disagreed with her about something. At first, I convinced myself she was simply strong-willed, modern, different from the women of my generation. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She did not just dislike me. She needed me diminished. And somehow, slowly, she had taught my own son to see me that way too. My phone buzzed suddenly against the center console. For one foolish second, I thought it might be Daniel apologizing. Instead, it was a message from Vanessa. You embarrassed us tonight. Daniel is upset. Please stop creating drama around our friends. I read the text twice. Then a third time. The coldness of it settled deep inside my chest, heavier than anger. Not one word acknowledging what she had done. Not one sentence asking whether I got home safely. Only blame. I looked through the windshield at the rows of parked cars shimmering beneath fluorescent garage lights. Somewhere above me, thunder rolled softly across the city. I realized then that Vanessa truly believed she had won tonight. She believed she had finally pushed me far enough to disappear quietly from their lives. Maybe another version of me would have done exactly that. Maybe the woman I was 10 years ago would have apologized simply to keep peace in the family. But grief changes people. Loneliness changes people. And something about hearing that plate shatter against the restaurant floor had awakened a part of me I had buried for a very long time. I opened my purse again and removed the watch box carefully. Then I placed it back inside and zipped the purse shut. Daniel would not be receiving my gift after all, because for the first time in my life, I was beginning to understand that love given without respect eventually turns into permission for cruelty. The next morning, I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the steady ticking of the hallway clock Richard bought at an antique market in Vermont nearly 20 years ago. For a long time, I stayed in bed staring at the pale gray light spreading slowly across my bedroom ceiling. Sleep had barely touched me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard porcelain shattering against marble again. I heard Vanessa's voice cutting through the restaurant like a blade sharpened over years of quiet resentment. Most painful of all was the expression on Daniel's face. Not anger, not guilt, exhaustion, as if loving his own mother had become an inconvenience he no longer had energy for. I finally rose and slipped into my robe before making coffee in the kitchen. The smell filled the room slowly, warm and familiar. Richard used to stand beside the window every morning reading the newspaper while I poured his first cup. Even now, nearly 2 years after losing him, part of me still expected to hear his footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. Grief was strange that way. It did not disappear. It simply learned how to sit quietly beside you. I carried my coffee into the sunroom, overlooking the backyard. Rainwater still clung to the rose bushes outside, sparkling faintly beneath the cloudy morning sky. Richard planted those roses himself the summer Daniel graduated from law school. He said every family needed something beautiful to care for together. Back then, we still believed success would make our son kinder instead of distant. My phone remained face down on the side table beside me. I had no desire to check whether Daniel finally called. Around 8:30, another message appeared anyway. This time it was from Daniel himself. Mom, Vanessa overreacted last night, but you also made things uncomfortable. Maybe it is best if everybody takes some space for a while. I read the sentence slowly, feeling something inside me settle into a calmness colder than anger. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of humiliation, just careful corporate language from a man who argued cases for a living and had apparently learned how to negotiate emotions the same way he negotiated contracts. I thought about all the years I defended him, all the times relatives warned me Vanessa seemed controlling, and I insisted they simply misunderstood her. Mothers spend decades building emotional homes for their children, only to realize one day they were never invited to live there permanently themselves. I set my coffee down untouched and walked upstairs toward Richard's old study. The room still smelled faintly of cedarwood and leather-bound books. His desk remained exactly as he left it, organized with impossible precision. I opened the bottom drawer searching for nothing in particular, perhaps only comfort. Instead, my fingers brushed against a cream-colored envelope tucked beneath a folder of financial records. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Margaret. Just that. Simple and familiar. My chest tightened unexpectedly. I sat down slowly in his chair before opening it. Inside was a short note dated 8 months before his death. If there ever comes a day when you feel alone in this family, do not forget who you are. You have always seen the good in people before seeing the danger. That is kindness, not weakness. I stopped reading for a moment because tears finally blurred my vision. Richard had noticed. Somehow, long before I allowed myself to admit it, he had already seen the cracks forming beneath our family. Beneath the note rested another paper folded neatly in half. At first, I assumed it was another financial statement. Then I recognized the restaurant logo printed across the top of the page. My stomach tightened instantly. It was not a dinner receipt. It was a partnership agreement. And Richard's signature was at the bottom. For several minutes, I simply stared at the paper in my hands while the grandfather clock downstairs echoed softly through the house. The restaurant logo at the top suddenly felt heavier than ink on a page. I adjusted my glasses and read the agreement again more carefully. 15 years earlier, Richard had quietly invested in the restaurant alongside an old business partner during its first year of operation. It had been struggling badly at the time. According to the documents, Richard's financial contribution helped keep the owners from filing bankruptcy during the winter recession. My fingers tightened slightly against the paper as memories slowly began returning. I remembered Richard mentioning a young chef trying to save a small downtown restaurant. I remembered attending a holiday opening party there years ago before the place became fashionable among lawyers and executives. At the time, I thought it had simply been one of Richard's many business ventures. He rarely discussed finances in detail because he never wanted money to define our marriage. But now, sitting alone in his study with rain clouds drifting beyond the windows, I realized the restaurant where Vanessa humiliated me was partially built with my late husband's help. A strange silence settled over me then. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter. The kind of clarity that arrives only after years of ignoring uncomfortable truths. I continued reading through the folder carefully. Richard's investment had eventually been transferred into a family trust managed after his death through a legal firm downtown. My name appeared throughout the documents as primary beneficiary. Daniel's name appeared only secondarily beneath mine. I leaned back slowly in Richard's chair while my heartbeat steadied itself. Vanessa had spent years treating me like an unwanted guest in their lives without realizing that legally, financially, and historically, I still stood much closer to the foundation of things than she ever had. My phone rang suddenly beside me on the desk, making me flinch slightly. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something inside me said answer it. Mrs. Whitmore, a young woman's voice asked carefully after I picked up. This is Claire Bennett from Bennett & Rowe. The name sounded familiar immediately. Bennett & Rowe was the law firm overseeing Richard's trust accounts. I apologize for disturbing you, she continued gently, but I believe there may have been an incident involving you at Marcello's restaurant last night. I sat up straighter without Speaking. Claire paused briefly before continuing in a quieter tone. One of our clients contacted the firm this morning after recognizing you. He was concerned. Concerned. The word itself felt strange after so much coldness. I am fine, I answered automatically. Thank you. But Claire did not sound convinced. Mrs. Whitmore, I worked with your husband before he passed. He spoke very highly of you. Something in her voice carried sincerity rather than politeness. There are also some matters regarding the restaurant partnership that I think you should review soon. I glanced again at the documents spread across the desk. I just found the papers myself, I admitted softly. Claire exhaled gently, as if confirming something she already suspected. Then perhaps Richard intended for you to see them eventually. Outside, the rain had finally begun to lighten, pale afternoon sunlight pushing weakly through the clouds above the backyard. Claire offered to arrange a meeting later that week. I agreed before hanging up. Afterward, I remained seated quietly in the study while the house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs. For the first time since the restaurant, I no longer felt like a helpless old woman standing alone in front of strangers. Vanessa believed she had embarrassed someone weak enough to disappear quietly. But she did not understand something important about women my age. We survive things younger people cannot even imagine. Loss, illness, betrayal, loneliness. We learn how to endure storms silently. And sometimes, when pushed too far, silence itself becomes a kind of power. 2 days later, I met Claire Bennett at a quiet cafe overlooking the Chicago River. The morning air carried the sharp smell of roasted coffee and wet pavement from another night of spring rain. I arrived early out of habit. Richard always believed arriving late signaled disrespect, and after 42 years of marriage, some habits remained stitched permanently into my bones. I chose a small corner table near the windows and folded my gloves carefully beside my purse while office workers hurried along the sidewalks outside, carrying paper cups and briefcases. At exactly 10:05, Claire entered the cafe wearing a navy wool coat and carrying a slim leather portfolio beneath her arm. She looked younger than I expected, perhaps early 30s. Intelligent eyes, calm posture, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. Mrs. Whitmore, she greeted gently, offering her hand. Thank you for meeting with me. I nodded politely and motioned for her to sit. For a moment, neither of us spoke while the waitress poured coffee into white ceramic cups between us. Claire waited until the waitress walked away before opening the portfolio. I debated whether to contact you, she admitted quietly. But after what happened at the restaurant, I felt you deserved to know everything. My chest tightened slightly at her choice of words. Everything. Claire slid several papers carefully across the table toward me. Financial statements, partnership reports, ownership percentages. I recognized Richard's signature immediately on several documents. Your husband maintained a silent investment position in Marcello's for over a decade, Claire explained. After his passing, your trust became the primary controlling interest holder. I looked down at the numbers again, trying to process them fully. Controlling interest? Claire gave a small nod. 51%. For a few seconds, the noise of the cafe faded into the background completely. Cups clinked somewhere nearby. A milk steamer hissed behind the counter. But all I could hear was Vanessa's voice inside the restaurant 2 nights earlier telling me I did not belong there. Claire continued carefully. Very few people know about the ownership structure. Your husband preferred privacy. I almost laughed at the irony of it. Vanessa had publicly humiliated the one person who legally owned most of the restaurant where she hosted her husband's celebration dinner. Life had a strange sense of timing sometimes. There is something else, Claire said softly. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more hesitant. After the incident, one of the managers reviewed security footage because several guests complained. I remained silent while she carefully removed a small envelope from the portfolio. The footage clearly shows your daughter-in-law provoking the situation intentionally. My fingers rested motionless against my coffee cup. Claire did not need to describe it further. I already remembered every detail too clearly. I am not interested in humiliating anyone, I said quietly after a moment. Claire studied me carefully across the table. I did not think you would be. There was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. That simple kindness nearly unraveled me more than cruelty ever could. But I do think, she continued gently, that you have spent a long time allowing people to rewrite your place in your own family. Her words settled deeply inside me because they were true. I thought about every holiday invitation withdrawn at the last minute. Every family photo where Vanessa positioned herself carefully between Daniel and me. Every polite smile concealing years of quiet exclusion. The cruelty itself was painful, but the slow erasure had been worse. Claire closed the folder neatly before sliding it toward me. Your husband protected more than financial assets, Mrs. Whitmore. He protected your authority. He simply trusted the wrong people to respect it after he was gone. Outside the cafe windows, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting pale reflections across the river water below. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar begin returning to me. Not revenge, not bitterness, something steadier. The realization that perhaps I had mistaken silence for peace all this time, when in reality silence had only made it easier for others to decide who mattered and who did not. That evening, I drove home through slow downtown traffic while Claire's words continued echoing quietly in my mind. Chicago looked different somehow through the windshield that night. The city lights reflecting across wet streets no longer felt cold and lonely. They felt sharp, clear, like waking up after years spent wandering through heavy fog. I stopped at a grocery store near my neighborhood before heading home, partly because my refrigerator was nearly empty and partly because I needed ordinary things to steady myself again. I walked slowly through the aisles beneath bright fluorescent lights while soft country music drifted overhead. An older man compared tomatoes carefully beside me. A tired mother pushed a shopping cart with a sleeping toddler curled beneath a blanket. Life continued normally for everyone else. Yet inside me, something fundamental had shifted. For years, I believed endurance alone made someone strong. Now I was beginning to understand that allowing cruelty to continue unchecked was not kindness. It was surrender. When I arrived home, dusk had already settled across the backyard. The roses outside Richard's study window moved gently beneath the evening breeze, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the lakefront. I unpacked groceries quietly before pouring myself a small glass of iced tea and sitting at the kitchen table with the partnership documents spread neatly in front of me again. This time, I noticed details I had overlooked before. Annual revenue reports, expansion agreements, property holdings connected to the restaurant group. Richard's investment had grown substantially over the years. Marcello's was no longer a single restaurant. It had become part of a small hospitality company with 3 additional locations across Illinois. And according to the trust structure, final operational authority still required my approval on several major business decisions. My approval. The words felt unfamiliar after so many years of being treated like someone whose opinions no longer mattered. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Daniel. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. Hello. Silence lingered briefly on the line before he spoke. Mom. His voice sounded tired. Careful. I think we should talk. I leaned back slowly in my chair while watching shadows deepen across the kitchen walls. About what? Another pause. Vanessa feels terrible about the misunderstanding at dinner. Misunderstanding. The words settled heavily between us. Not humiliation. Not cruelty. Not disrespect. Just another polished excuse designed to smooth over damage without acknowledging it honestly. Does she? I asked quietly. Daniel exhaled softly. She has been under stress lately. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. The endless protection. The constant bending of reality to preserve Vanessa's image while my pain became inconvenient background noise. Your father used to say stress reveals character, I answered calmly. Daniel did not respond immediately. I imagined him standing somewhere inside his expensive downtown condo, loosening his tie the way Richard once did after work. Except Richard never allowed anyone to speak to his family with cruelty disguised as honesty. Mom, Daniel said finally, I think everybody just needs to move forward. Move forward. Another corporate phrase. Another emotional shortcut. My gaze drifted toward the framed family photograph still hanging near the hallway entrance. It was taken 12 years earlier at a lake house in Wisconsin. Daniel stood beside me smiling with one arm around my shoulders before Vanessa entered our lives. Looking at that picture now felt like remembering someone who no longer existed. Do you know what hurt most? I asked quietly. Daniel fell silent again. It was not what she said. It was watching my own son sit there and decide keeping his wife comfortable mattered more than protecting his mother. His breathing shifted slightly on the line. For the first time since the restaurant, he sounded unsettled rather than defensive. "That is not fair," he muttered. I looked down at Richard's partnership documents spread across the kitchen table beneath my hands. "No," I replied softly. "What happened at that restaurant was not fair." Then I ended the call before he could answer. The silence afterward felt enormous inside the house. But unlike before, it no longer felt empty. It felt like space finally clearing itself after years of being crowded by people who expected me to shrink quietly around their comfort. 3 days passed before Daniel came to the house. I knew he was arriving before he even knocked because his silver BMW pulled into the driveway at exactly 6:15, the same punctuality Richard once admired in him. Through the front window, I watched my son step out wearing a charcoal overcoat and carrying the tense expression of a man walking into a meeting he did not want to attend. For a brief moment, seeing him standing there beneath the porch light brought back an ache so familiar it nearly softened me again. Mothers do not stop loving their children simply because those children disappoint them. That was the tragedy of it. Love survives long after respect begins dying. I opened the door before he could knock twice. "Mom," he said quietly. I stepped aside without answering. The house smelled faintly of rosemary chicken and fresh bread cooling in the kitchen. I had cooked dinner out of habit more than hospitality. Daniel removed his coat, slowly while glancing around the living room as though noticing the house properly for the first time in years. Richard's framed photographs still lined the mantel. The old piano remained near the staircase untouched since the funeral. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Only the people inside had changed. "You cooked?" he asked, sounding almost surprised. "People still need to eat after unpleasant evenings," I replied calmly. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. We sat across from each other at the dining table beneath the soft amber chandelier Richard installed himself nearly 20 years earlier. Rain tapped gently against the windows again, while steam curled upward from our untouched plates. The silence between us felt heavy, but no longer fragile. I was no longer afraid of it. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Vanessa feels like you hate her." I looked at him steadily across the table. "Vanessa has spent years treating me like an unwanted burden. Hate has nothing to do with it." He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You two have never understood each other." I almost smiled at that. Such a careful sentence. So polished. It amazed me how often people rewrote cruelty into misunderstanding simply because acknowledging the truth felt uncomfortable. "Daniel," I said softly, "when your father died, I lost the person who protected my place in this family. After that, things changed." His expression tightened immediately. "That is not fair." "No," I answered quietly. "Fair would have been your wife showing basic respect to the woman who raised you." He leaned back heavily in his chair, frustration finally surfacing beneath his controlled tone. "You always make Vanessa sound manipulative." I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate before answering. "That is because she is." The room went completely still after that. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Daniel stared at me, as if hearing my honesty for the first time in his life. "She thinks you judge everything she does," he muttered. I watched her publicly humiliate me in a restaurant while my own son stayed seated. My voice remained calm, which somehow made the words heavier. Daniel opened his mouth to respond before stopping himself. For the first time, uncertainty flickered visibly across his face. I realized then that Vanessa had probably spent years shaping every narrative before he ever heard my side of things. Claire's words returned quietly to me. "You have spent a long time allowing people to rewrite your place in your own family." Daniel looked exhausted now, older somehow than his 41 years. "I just wanted peace," he admitted finally. There it was. The truth. Not love. Not loyalty. Convenience. He had chosen whichever version of reality kept conflict away from his own life the longest. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward Richard's study without another word. When I returned moments later, I placed the partnership documents gently in front of him. Daniel frowned in confusion before lowering his eyes to the restaurant logo printed across the top page. I watched his expression shift slowly as he recognized his father's signature. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "Your father's ownership agreement," I replied. "The restaurant where your wife decided I did not belong." Daniel stared down at the papers while color slowly drained from his face. For once, he had no carefully prepared response waiting. Daniel remained motionless at the dining table for several seconds, staring down at the partnership agreement as if the paper itself had altered the shape of the room around him. His fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the document while rain continued sliding softly down the windows behind us. I could almost see the memories rearranging themselves. Inside his mind, the restaurant, Vanessa's outburst, his father's signature beneath the ownership agreement. For the first time since Richard died, Daniel looked genuinely uncertain of the reality he had been living inside. "Dad never told me about this," he said quietly at last. His voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. I sat back down slowly across from him and folded my hands together on the table. "Your father believed some things should remain private unless they became necessary." Daniel glanced up toward me then, his expression troubled. "And now it is necessary?" I held his gaze steadily. "Your wife publicly humiliated me in a business your father helped build while you sat there pretending it was simply an uncomfortable misunderstanding." "Yes, Daniel. I would say it became necessary." The silence afterward stretched heavily between us. Somewhere upstairs, the old heating vents clicked softly through the walls. Daniel lowered his eyes again toward the paperwork spread across the table. "Vanessa did not know any of this," he muttered weakly. I almost smiled at the irony. "No," I answered calmly. "She did not. For years, Vanessa had treated me like someone powerless, disposable, a lonely widow whose opinions no longer carried weight inside the family she helped create. Perhaps if she had known the truth about the restaurant, she would have behaved differently. But somehow that possibility only made everything sadder. Respect motivated by money was not respect at all." Daniel rubbed both hands slowly across his face before leaning back in his chair. He suddenly looked exhausted in a way I had never noticed before. "Older, less certain. Claire Bennett contacted me this afternoon," he admitted quietly. "That caught my attention immediately." "She did." He nodded once. "She said there was security footage from the restaurant." "Oh, so now we had arrived at the center of things." Daniel's breathing shifted slightly before he continued. "She said Vanessa approached your table before anything happened. She said it did not look accidental." I remained silent. There was no need to defend myself anymore. The truth had finally begun speaking on its own. Daniel stared toward the darkened kitchen for several long seconds before speaking again. "Vanessa told me you insulted her first." I looked at him carefully across the table. "And did you believe that?" He hesitated. That hesitation alone answered the question more painfully than words could have. "I wanted to believe there was another explanation," he admitted finally. I thought about that sentence for a long moment. People often mistook denial for loyalty because accepting painful truths required courage many never developed. Daniel had spent years avoiding conflict by trusting whichever story demanded the least from him emotionally. Unfortunately, that choice always came at someone else's expense. Usually mine. "Your father used to tell me something after difficult trials," I said softly. Daniel looked up slowly. He said character is revealed most clearly in moments when people believe there will be no consequences. The room became very still after that. Daniel lowered his gaze again toward the partnership papers while thunder rolled faintly in the distance outside. I could see the realization settling slowly across his face now. Vanessa did not lose control for one reckless second at the restaurant. She behaved exactly as she believed she was allowed to behave. And somewhere along the way, my son had taught her there would never be consequences for humiliating his mother. Finally, Daniel pushed his untouched dinner plate slightly away from himself and exhaled heavily. "I do not know what to do," he admitted. For the first time in years, he sounded less like a polished attorney and more like the uncertain boy who once asked his father for advice about everything. I looked at him quietly across the table while rainwater shimmered against the windows behind him. "That is because you spent too long trying to keep peace between truth and disrespect," I answered gently. "Eventually, one of them always wins." 2 months later, I returned to Marcello's on a cool Friday evening, just as the city lights began glowing against the darkening Chicago skyline. Summer had finally settled over the lakefront, warm enough for outdoor dining and open windows carrying the soft sounds of traffic and jazz music through downtown streets. I stood for a moment outside the restaurant entrance before stepping inside. The smell of garlic, fresh bread, and polished wood greeted me immediately, familiar now in an entirely different way than before. This time, nobody stared when I entered. Nobody whispered. The hostess recognized me instantly and smiled warmly. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore." she said with genuine kindness. Your table is ready. My table. Such simple words. Yet they settled somewhere deep inside me with surprising weight. She guided me toward a quiet corner near the tall front windows overlooking the river. White candles flickered softly between crystal glasses while conversations drifted gently around the dining room. The pianist played slow jazz near the bar exactly as he had the night. Everything changed. Only now, the music no longer sounded sharp or painful. It sounded peaceful. Claire Bennett stood near the manager's station reviewing paperwork when she noticed me. She crossed the dining room with a warm smile and lightly touched my shoulder. You look wonderful, she said softly. I smiled back. I finally feel like myself again. And it was true. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. It had not. Daniel and Vanessa were separated now, though the process had been quiet and painfully private. Daniel eventually learned far more than he expected after reviewing financial records and messages Vanessa had hidden for years. He discovered invitations I never received. Family gatherings intentionally scheduled without me. Even cruel comments she made about me to friends while smiling politely to my face at holidays. None of it brought me satisfaction. Only sadness for how long my son allowed himself to confuse avoidance with loyalty. Daniel had started visiting again occasionally. Not often. Not easily. Trust rebuilds slowly after years of neglect. But for the first time in a long while, he listened when I spoke instead of immediately defending someone else's version of events. Grief had changed both of us in different ways. Sometimes healing begins only after illusions finally collapse completely. A waiter approached my table, carrying a menu before pausing with slight recognition in his eyes. It was the same young man who apologized to me the night the plate shattered across the floor. His expression softened visibly. It is good to see you again, ma'am, he said quietly. Thank you, I answered gently. It is good to be here under different circumstances. He nodded once before walking away. Outside the windows, boats moved slowly across the dark river while city lights shimmered against the water like scattered gold. I folded my hands together on the table and allowed myself to breathe fully for what felt like the first time in years. The strange thing about humiliation is that it convinces you your worth depends on how others choose to see you. For too long, I allowed myself to become smaller so other people could remain comfortable. Softer, quieter, easier to dismiss. But age has a way of stripping illusions away one by one until only truth remains standing. And the truth was this. I had spent decades building a family, supporting a husband, raising a son, preserving traditions, and offering love even when it was not returned properly. None of that disappeared simply because someone younger decided I had become inconvenient. Claire returned briefly carrying a small envelope. This belonged to your husband, she explained softly. We found it in one of the original partnership files. After she walked away, I opened it carefully beneath the candlelight. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard in his familiar steady script. Never let anyone make you feel invisible in rooms you helped build. My throat tightened unexpectedly as I read the sentence again. Around me, glasses clinked softly while laughter drifted through the restaurant. Life continued moving forward exactly as it always does. But this time, I no longer felt like a forgotten woman sitting quietly at the edge of everyone else's story. I lifted my wine glass slightly toward the empty chair across from me where Richard once would have sat and smiled faintly to myself. Some women disappear with age. I finally understood that I was never one of them.